Hello BookTube, it's Joshua here, and I'm going to be doing a little review of Dune. Um, I just read this book about a week ago. I finished it about a week ago, and I was reading it all of June for the event Dune in June. And I'm very glad I read it. The very first time that I read it was about 2 or 3 years ago in high school, and that was that time I didn't really know what to think of the novel. I don't think I particularly liked it or understood it. Um, I just remember coming away from it without much of an impression, and reading it this second time around has confirmed for me that I definitely missed a lot of things the first time reading Dune. Um, so yeah, I'm very glad that I read it this second time. Very, very glad, because I now I really enjoyed it. I can kind of appreciate a lot of the things that Frank Herbert was doing here, I think. And the first thing that I want to talk about in this novel is Frank Herbert's dialogue. I think it's rare to find an author who writes dialogue so subtly and so expertly that the reader, instead of just reading it and taking the meaning at its surface value, the reader actually has to read between the lines very carefully. And so I was often forced to slow down and really think about what each character's motivations were and what was the meaning behind the words. Because oftentimes I think the characters wouldn't say exactly what they meant, or they would be implying something between each other. And it would be up to me it would be up to the reader to figure that out, because Frank Herbert wasn't gonna spell it out for you. He was very subtle in that way. And I really like that about the dialogue. I haven't found that I haven't found this to be the case for most novels that I've read in the past. It seems like it's probably a very difficult thing to do. And I really enjoyed grappling with his really good dialogue. And the next point that I want to highlight or the next element that I would like to talk about in Dune is Frank Herbert's use of perspective. I found it really interesting that Herbert would switch between perspectives very freely. Sometimes we'd be in the head of Paul Atreides, sometimes in the head of Duke Leto, or in Jessica, Paul Atreides' mother. But oftentimes we would also be in the head of the Emperor, or in the perspective of the Harkonnens, or the Fremen. So it really jumped everywhere, and I thought that Frank Herbert used this freedom to switch perspectives very skillfully. Oftentimes we would be in the head of one character, and then we would immediately switch to another character, and in that sense Frank Herbert would kind of create some irony, like one character would be thinking one thing, and then another character would be thinking the exact opposite thing, or another character would have some kind of information that the other character doesn't know, and it created a lot of, I think the word would be, dramatic irony in this novel, and I thought that was really interestingly done. And the next element that I would like to talk about is just Frank Herbert's ability to describe things. It seems like that's probably a very underrated thing in this novel. He's not super flowery or super showy, but I found that sometimes he could be very poetic when he wanted to be, and that he was just very accurate and skillful at describing things. And I actually have a passage that I want to share with you. I discovered this passage, or I fixated on this passage because Steve Donoghue, in one of his videos about Dune, highlighted it and I'll leave that video in the description for you guys to watch. It's in part one of Dune, and it's Duke Leto just looking at a sunset on Arrakis. And there are a couple paragraphs here that I want to read to you. A pre-dawn hush had come over the desert basin. He looked up. Straight overhead, the stars were a sequin shawl flung over blue-black. Low on the southern horizon, the night's second moon peered through a thin dust haze, an unbelieving moon that looked at him with a cynical light. And that was one paragraph, and I want to skip a couple more paragraphs to this one here. To the east, the night grew a faggot of luminous gray, then seashell opalescence that dimmed the stars. There came the long, bell-tolling movement of dawn striking across a broken horizon. And then, if I read you one more, there's one here that goes, he had never imagined anything here could be as beautiful as that shattered red horizon and the purple and ochre cliffs. Beyond the landing field, where the night's faint dew had touched life into the hurried seeds of Arrakis, he saw great puddles of red blooms and, running through them, an articulate tread of violet, like giant footsteps. Just really, really unique descriptions. And I when I was reading it, I wasn't really looking for these kinds of things. So Steve's video, which highlighted this passage, was really helpful in pointing that element of this novel out to me. And I also wanted to mention one specific stylistic tick or choice that Frank Herbert was making, which I thought was pretty interesting. Oftentimes in his sentences, he would leave out connector words, especially when I think describing action. So an example of that would be Paul walked across the sand, tightened his still suit. So instead of saying Paul walked across the sand and then tightened his still suit, he just goes Paul walked across the sand and then puts a comma and then tightened his still suit. And I noticed that he was I noticed that Herbert was writing his sentences like that frequently throughout the novel, and I just thought that was interesting. I figure it must be some kind of stylistic choice. I'm not sure exactly why. I don't know what effect it has on the reader, but I just noticed that and wanted to mention it. And I also wanted to talk about the plot. I thought, well, this book is obviously very big, and the size of the narrative in terms of what happens is really grand. But it didn't feel like it was big. At least it didn't feel like the book took a long time to read, or it wasn't a slog, in other words. Herbert does a really good job of actually just skipping or jumping forward in time to only the essential scenes or the scenes that he needs to complete the story. And by doing that, I think he makes the novel much less of a slog. He makes it, in fact, very, very thrilling. And it also kind of forced me to infer what had happened in between those scenes. And Herbert doesn't leave you in the dust in that sense. He doesn't make you guess. He tells you what happens in a roundabout way. He tells you without giving you an exposition dump at the same time, if that makes sense. So yeah, it would, again, everything, all of these things are huge positives. But I do want to talk about a couple personal qualms that I have. They aren't objective criticisms, but I didn't like at the end. Sorry. From now on, I think there's going to be some spoilers about the end of the novel. But I didn't like at the end how Paul became pretty unlikable. He became kind of a tyrant figure, or it felt like he was some controlling tyrant. He There were a couple times at the end where Gurney Halleck, the soldier who worked for his dad, for Paul's dad, Duke Leto, and who was now loyal to him, Paul. There were times where Gurney Halleck he tried to reprimand Paul for being for not caring as much about his own people as he should be. The Duke Leto was always a very caring leader. He cared about his men more than about money or success, really. But I think by the end of the novel, I think at the beginning of the novel, Paul was also taught to act that way. But by the end of the novel, that sense of humanity was lost in Paul. So there are a couple of times where Gurney Halleck has to remind Paul that you shouldn't be worrying about money or about your equipment, because, well, you shouldn't be worrying about that stuff as much as you should be worrying about the men who have died or are dying right now. And Paul doesn't even really listen to Gurney Halleck. He just kind of it goes in one ear and out the other ear. So that was kind of unlikable, and I'm sure Frank Herbert intended for Paul to turn out like that. Like, it's not an objective criticism. It doesn't make the book bad, but I just wish Paul hadn't turned out that way. Yeah, and also I there was one thing that felt like somewhat of a plot hole. It's also at the end. Some more spoilers. It's when Paul is dealing with the guild navigators at the very end of the novel, where he threatens them with destroying the spice and the worms on Arrakis, because the guild is reliant on spice to they're entirely reliant on spice for prescience, so that they can transport, so that they can move through space at light speed or whatever it is. And Paul threatens to destroy the spice. But if he's starting to destroy the spice, well, he's addicted to the spice, and so are all of his fremen. So if he were to destroy the spice, he would also be killing himself and his entire army and his family, everyone on Arrakis. Which doesn't make sense to me. He wouldn't do that, right? Like he wouldn't actually do that, and yet the guild navigators seem to take him seriously, and the threat works, even though it's clearly just an empty threat. I don't know. That was one plot hole, possibly, that bugged me. But other than that, this was a really thrilling read. It was really enjoyable, and I think I've missed a lot in here. I've been watching Steve Donoghue's videos. He's making a video for every chapter. All through the summer, he's gonna be he's gonna be doing a read along of Dune and talking about it. I've actually made a playlist on my own channel where I'm collecting those videos. So if any of you guys want to watch Steve Donoghue's videos, I highly recommend you to do that. And the playlist is in my channel. So yeah, I definitely missed a lot, and so at some point I would like to reread this and try to get more out of it next time. But I think that's all I have to say. Thank you for watching BookTube, and goodbye.